Everyone, please take a seat. We're ready to get started. We are awaiting still one of our speakers who will join us while our discussion is in process. But we would appreciate it if everyone still standing could find a seat and make themselves comfortable. Good afternoon. I'm Solly Booker. I'm a Senior Program Officer for Global Governance and International Cooperation here at the Ford Foundation. It's a new portfolio, big and challenging. I'm delighted to welcome you here today on behalf of the Foundation and our co-convener and grantee partner, Equal International, to discuss how we can begin to apply the principles of global public investment, or GPI, to the challenges of our time, from pandemics to climate change and inequality, and how we can apply these principles to secure a more equitable and effective model of multilateral cooperation to achieve the global development goals of the 2030 Agenda and beyond. Equal International has done a remarkable job in supporting a global process of co-creation and the extensive convening of diverse actors in order to advance this ambitious GPI agenda. I'd also like to thank our other partners with whom we have co-created this event today, including the African Center for Economic Transformation, Civicus, the Jaap Lang Institute, Open Society Foundations, and Partners in Health. I should also mention that our president, Darren Walker, published a guest essay in today's New York Times entitled, "A More Inclusive Global Order is Possible." The piece is very much aligned with what we will be discussing here today, and I encourage everyone to read it. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started with a presentation by a member of the Expert Working Group on Global Public Investment that has worked over the last 2 years to sharpen the definition of the problem of international cooperation, to elaborate the proposed solution of global public investment, and to lead us on a path toward the implementation of that very promising concept. So to help us understand the basic principles of GPI and how we might apply them, I'm going to turn the floor over to Solange Baptiste, who is the Executive Director of the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition based in South Africa, and who was a founding member of the Expert Working Group on Global Public Investment. Solange, the floor, all of them are yours.
Thank you very much. It's great to see everyone. Let's see if I have this microphone. We are very excited to see everyone and to have this session today. I have been tasked to get us oriented with what GPI means, and so hopefully I can do that. It's a quite complicated topic, but I'll try to do it as quickly as I can because it really has a simple take-home message. I am one of many, so I am, not everyone could be on the stage, so my name is Solange, as was introduced. I'm one of about 25 of the Expert Working Group, as you'll see them pictured here, and we also have a smaller group that is a transitional working group that has been working on our topic. So what is GPI? I think it is important for us to kind of pause. It's titled here, "What's in a Name?" Each of the words is important. It's global because it cross-border objectives as well as national progress. We also don't want to exclude the regional aspects of what we're talking about. So although it's global in its ambition, we want to think about all the other sub-levels that are important. It's public funds accountable to all and directed by all. And we want to make sure that we understand what all means in terms of publics, including civil society, and what does public good look like. And the investment, social, environmental, and economic gains. So this group that you saw in the previous slide have been really trying to grapple with what this looks like. And we're really excited because we were able to launch the GPI network this a few hours ago at the Clinton Global Initiative, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So where does it take us? There are about five, those are the 5 circles here. We have to think about 5 evolving narratives. We have to frame the ambition, and we need to have the ambition very clear, from a narrow focus on reducing poverty or one specific theme to meeting broader challenges of inequality and sustainability. We have to think about the function. We have to think about the geography, from one-directional north-south transfers to a universal effort with paying in and all benefiting. We think about the governance, from outdated post-colonial institutions to representative decision-making. And we also have to think about what's the narrative. What is the story that we're telling here? From the language of patronizing foreign aid to empowering multilateralism of a common fiscal endeavor. So, we really think about this in terms of 3 key principles, and it really helps to kind of dismantle the issue or the current status quo of donor recipients. So this sort of binary power dynamic that exists in the systems that we have today, where all countries contribute according to their ability. So we need to have budget lines, all countries, not just what we call quote unquote donor countries, but all countries have to contribute. All countries are involved in the decision making, so not just because you put more money, you have more say. We need to have an equalization in that space. And all countries can benefit from GPI, but poorer countries can receive more support. So if we look at this and we try to break it down a little bit further, all contribute. So we have paying in. So international contributions through new or established budget lines, specific or global issues in countries of all income levels. In-country spending as a portion of domestic contributions. And then we move into the all deciding. So high-level determination, annual quarterly meetings. And this is just a sort of illustrative view of what it could look like. So we haven't figured this out. These are the things we're grappling with as we consider what GPI means. And we, you need to really want to point out here the importance of civil society. We often think about subject matter experts, the UNSG representation, other stakeholders, and obviously governments. But quite often civil society is left out in terms of voting power. So that is a really important thing to think through as we come through lessons of the Financial Intermediary Fund and all of our pandemic preparedness, because everybody's ears is primed for that because of our recent COVID pandemic. And then all benefits. So really important take-home message here is that we're not trying to build something new. The implementation through existing organizations is really critical, and we can see the payout here if you think about things through health, digital transformation, development banks, climate, and disaster risk reduction. So as this working group, we have been trying to consider why GPI, why now, why is it right, why is it important, and we wanted to make sure that people agreed. So we have a report on the progress, why we back GPI, so what does it mean for all to benefit, how could GPI be spent, all decide, all contribute, and the co-creation roadmap. So you can look for this report if you want to learn more. And so the recommendations from the expert working group of GPI, we'll see there 1 through 8, and I don't really want to read each one for you, but it's really about adopting GPI principles into all new and existing global funds and initiatives, establishing GPI budget lines, which I spoke to before, establishing GPI principles at the core of global health financing, incorporating GPI into efforts to reinvigorate climate finance, evolve the regional public investment mechanisms to complement GPI, and then link to other global, regional, and national campaigns, especially on inequality. And the importance of building in an inclusive GPI network to enable co-creation. So that's the one thing I'm super excited about today, and engage in major UN processes on the road to 2030. So if we think about the added value of GPI, and we want to understand why GPI and why now, I'm sure no one will disagree that we have a sort of a coinciding of many different crises around us. We have climate issues, pandemic, cost of living, hunger, energy, and inequality. And according to some of the statistics that we've learned, about 2.5 trillion funding gap to meet the SDGs every year. I think when I learned that statistic, I actually didn't believe it. I thought it was like cumulatively, but it's every year we have a gap of 2.5 trillion. So that means we need to save these SDGs. We've made these highly ambitious targets. We laid out the ambition, but we are not anywhere near achieving them. So we have to do something different. We have to create and design a system that actually works for people and for all people everywhere. So we're thinking about the pathway to more money. We're thinking that you need to have inclusive mechanisms to get to more money. We need to have predictable mechanisms to get to better money. We need to be co-creative, not have an idea and then consult and pretend that we actually co-created that and just rubber stamp it by some other countries. And that will lead us to smarter money. We need to be growth and adaptive in our approach so that we're future-proof. What are we going to see in the future? And then we need to see equal footing, so all decide, all contribute, and all benefit. We have growing support from civil society, health pandemics, not surprising, climate, inequality, social protection, aid, decolonization. We also have growing support from governments showing early interest. We have Indonesia, Mexico, Chile, Uruguay, Norway, Sweden, and others. We have UN agencies who are seeing that this idea actually has legs and we can make it work. And the foundations are very much interested in this. And so when we think about how are we going to make this a reality, because it's one thing to talk about these wonderful topics at the macro level, but how do we now actually put rubber to the road? So we looked at the world coming before us and looked for policy opportunities for GPI. And this is a list of them here, but really wanting to underscore the second SDG Summit in September 2023 and the fourth Financing for the Development Summit and the Summit of the Future as opportunities where we can see how GPI principles cannot just be principles that are talked about, but actually implemented in how we go forward in shaping our future. So the civil society folks have gotten together and we joined now for the GPI network, which was launched today at the Clinton Global Initiative. And I would like to put up our exciting certificate, which is a commitment to action from the Clinton Global Initiative. There are no zeros, there are no dollar signs on this certificate. It's a lot of commitment. So I just want to acknowledge that now we have to do the work to actually make this happen. But this is a first step and a really exciting step that the network has been launched and we're able to move forward. And then we have, I think that's a good. And then if you want to get involved, if you're sitting here as a government or you're an agency, utilize GPI in your efforts, join the GPI Diplomacy Working Group, and to put GPI at the core of the UN SDG Declaration coming in September next year. So I think that is where I will end. We're more excited about hearing what the panelists have to say, and I will now like to introduce you to Professor Alicia Yamin. She's a senior advisor on human rights and health policy at Partners in Health, as well as a lecturer on law and senior fellow on global health and rights at Harvard Law School. She's also a member of the expert working group on GPI. Over to you, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Solange. So before we get to our really wonderful panel, I cannot help but thinking today as I sit here that my beloved friend and the visionary co-founder of Partners in Health would be so happy that we are all gathered here today. He would be so honored that global public investment is incorporated into a congressional resolution and in his tribute today that is being introduced on the floor of the U.S. Congress. He would be thrilled that the Clinton Global Initiative has taken a step to create this GPIN network, which is the first step in building a network, a movement for global public investment. And Paul was, for anybody, and many of us in this room did know him, he was always challenging us to think more boldly, not to allow our collective imaginations to be shackled by what is reasonable or appropriate in the minds of the powers that be. And Partners in Health has done exactly that for decades, providing quality health care, providing antiretroviral therapy, treatment-resistant therapy for tuberculosis, cancer therapy, et cetera. But in the core, he knew that what was driving the egregious health inequities was an unfit-for-purpose financial architecture. And that is why we're here today, and he would be absolutely thrilled to talk about global public investment, about more money and better money, public money, reclaiming public resources to spend on common needs, on common problems that transcend borders, like pandemics that are not over there and stay over there, as we well know. That Pakistan cannot deal alone with the flooding that it is facing. These are common problems and common needs and require long-term investment. And for those people who don't care about global equity or justice or social justice, it is in the interest of the powers that be to prevent those calamities, to have long-term sustained investment as opposed to waiting for them to happen and picking up the pieces. So it is really my absolute pleasure to introduce this spectacular panel. And I will introduce them each as I ask a first question. Our first speaker really needs no introduction. Winnie Banayama is a champion, has long been a champion in civil society. She is now the head of UNAIDS, and it's just a great pleasure to have you here. And I guess I will ask you a first question now, and that is that, you know, AIDS funding was sort of the success story of the Millennium Development Goals. The Global Fund in particular has some global public investment principles. So why don't you tell us why you think GPI is useful and what it can do?
Thank you, Alicia. Oh, I need the mic. Thank you, Alicia. And thank you, good people, for coming to this meeting. And it's an honor to be on this panel. Let me be blunt. I'll be blunt. The big lesson from AIDS and from the COVID pandemics is that the current system to respond to global health challenges is inadequate. It's outdated. It's colonial. It doesn't work. Power and decision-making lie in the hands of a handful of northern governments, northern entities, and even northern individuals, sometimes doing good, but not always operating for the global good. It's not adequate. It's high time we had a fairer, a more effective response to global health challenges. 3 lessons we've learned. First, that we can radically increase the available resources for global health to fight diseases. We saw that in COVID. Money was raised suddenly to invest in companies to speed up and find a vaccine. But in doing that, we have to reconsider the donor-developing country relationship. It has to be guided by principles of co-creation, co-financing, co-decision-making, so that we actually do end pandemics. So in AIDS, we learned that the neo-colonial financing system was unjust and led to failures. How can I not call it a failure when 12 million people died, 12 million died of AIDS, mainly in Africa, when life-saving ARVs were already here, being given to people in these countries? That's a failure. So when the Global Fund was created, it put governments in the Global South and communities, ordinary citizens, as voting members of its board. That was a big change, a big step forward, so that decisions are not made for those people, but they are there to shape those decisions. To me, that's the bare minimum, Alicia. It's the bare minimum. But we should expect more, a more decolonized management of resources. Unfortunately, the world is moving in the wrong direction. Now the G20 went and met somewhere and created what they call the Financial Intermediary Fund, sitting in the World Bank. Basically, a system where decisions are made according to who contributes the most. So those who don't have money to contribute don't shape those decisions. How's that a solution? It simply won't work. It's a movement in the wrong direction. It didn't work during COVID. We saw it. Today, only 1% of all the vaccines, these good ones you all have in your arms, including me, mRNA, only 1% is reaching Africa. And we are not over with COVID. So it doesn't work. So it didn't work during COVID, didn't work during AIDS. We need to do better. That's why I'm here to support global public investment as an idea. And by the way, we are not dreamers. Everything begins with an idea. You push it, you build a movement, it becomes a reality. So I'm here because I believe that it's an idea that has reached its time. The second lesson I've learned is that public funding of truly universal health care systems and innovation is absolutely key for everything. Look at it. Early research and development of most medicines and vaccines is always funded by the public. The privatization of profits comes after people, citizens, have invested the first money. That is the case. Today, you might not know this, but we follow the money. $37 billion made by Pfizer on this one vaccine, Pfizer, from a vaccine that was funded by public money. We saw the money go into it. In 2.5 years, we've created 40 new pharma billionaires. I mean, it's wrong, and we should call it so. It's unjust that ordinary citizens put their money to create a life-saving technology, and some people with capital come later and take huge profits out of it and deny ordinary citizens. So it's a rigged system. We must change it. And lastly, pandemic healthcare and medical technologies have to be treated as global public goods. And this is not for charity. It's not because we want to help helpless people. It's simply that viruses don't recognize borders. It's pointless to try to protect your people within your borders. We've seen that. So we must make global health of everybody, a global public good. I will not go further. I know you want me to stop there. So, but I must end by talking about HIV as an example. We now have long-acting prevention tools, injectables. A person can get this injection in their arm and live their life and not have to contract HIV. But this is available here on your streets in New York. But who needs it most? It is gay men who are hiding from the law in my country, Uganda, who need that injection. It is girls who are being preyed upon, forced sex, who need protection out there in Africa, most vulnerable group, but they won't have it because of this rigged system. So global public investment is what will solve this injustice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for those inspirational words. And I just want to highlight a couple of things that GPI needs, of course, to be twinned with work to challenge those global rigged rules of the game that Winnie was pointing to, the intellectual property regimes, the piles and layers of debt and austerity that cripple the capacity for using public money to invest in common goods. And we're very, very aware of that GPI is not by itself going to solve the inequality in the financial architecture. I do now want to turn, because I know he has to leave, we have with us Avinash Perso, who is the chair of the CARICOM Commission on the Economy. He is a special envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, on investment and financial services, and he's the emeritus professor at Grisham College in the UK. And Avinash, you know, your Prime Minister, I in fact just heard her speak this morning at the Clinton Global Initiative, has been extraordinarily boldly outspoken on climate and development and social justice. And how do you see these issues converging, and what do you think the role is for GPI?
Thank you, Alicia. And let me also thank the Ford Foundation for all the work they've done and for this event and the reason behind this event. It's been a while since I've been here. Years and years ago, I used to visit Ford on the invitation of Butch Montez on looking at volatile capital flows, so it's great to be back. I think GPI is a very important initiative, a very important piece of work. As someone representing a developing country, I'm sure all of us in this room are self-selected people who believe in internationalism. But we also believe in a different kind of internationalism. It's not just internationalism. We have an internationalism today that actually, in many ways, beats up developing countries. So we don't only want more internationalism, we want a different kind of internationalism. And one of those issues are the boundaries of internationalism. So, for example, we are a climate vulnerable country. We're in the Caribbean. These days we have ever increasingly devastating floods and droughts and hurricanes. When Hurricane Maria went through the Caribbean a few years ago, wiped out 200% of GDP of some of the island states. I remember I had a sort of intriguing job of trying to support Dominica after Maria, and when I went around telling people 200% of GDP, a lot of people thought you couldn't lose more than 100%. How do you lose 200%? But of course, those countries are not eligible for concessional financing in the current architecture of international aid because their GDP is more than $1,250 per year. And so we need to relook at the way we do these boundaries. And GPI is one of the ways in which we can relook at the world and have a more sophisticated division. We strongly believe, for example, in dealing with the climate crisis, that we need concessional funds for climate vulnerable countries to invest in climate adaptation before the disaster hits, not afterwards. We were granted after COVID, during COVID, temporary access to concessional financing to deal with the disaster. And we've been saying, well, that's like helping us pay for the undertaker. We need concessional financing before the disaster happens to build greater resilience and adaptation in our countries, which are very vulnerable. So I think that GPI will play an important role in relooking at the way we source and distribute aid. But let me end with this observation. The key problems we need to solve are ones of scale and balance sheet. Because if you look at existing ODA, it's just in the wrong ballpark. We are short not of billions, but of trillions. ODA is now irrelevant to global development. It's irrelevant. We need trillions of dollars. And when we look at so what is the mechanism that will drive trillions of dollars? Especially when developing countries do not have the balance sheet. You can give us all the concessional money you want, but our debt to GDP ratios will reach a point where the international rating agencies, the IMF, the multilateral development banks will say, you've got too much debt, you're not sustainable, you can't accept it. And so we need a different system altogether. And I think one way of encapsulating the different system, and Winnie sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, if you look at Poland today borrows at 1% over the German borrowing rate. Look at South Africa. South Africa borrows at about 9% over the German borrowing rate. And why is that? Is that because South Africa has these terrible economic fundamentals, these challenging politics? In fact, the fundamentals of South Africa, in both its economic and social and political, are similar to Poland. The difference is that Poland has another balance sheet it can rely upon. It's not the Polish balance sheet that determines Polish interest rates. It's the fact it can rely upon a European balance sheet. It can rely upon an international balance sheet. If we want to fund the trillions of dollars we need for global public goods, we need an international balance sheet. The local balance sheets can't do it. We need global financial instruments that will fund a global balance sheet. And we've been arguing for a $500 billion issuance of SDRs that will form the capital for a global balance sheet. And from that global balance sheet, we should be investing in global public goods. Of course, climate mitigation is a key one, but not the only one when we are so far behind in the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think that, yes, we need to improve the existing way in which we deliver ODA, but we also need something quite different. We need a new balance sheet, a global balance sheet, so that we do not put the burdens and the burdens of GPGs on the tiny balance sheets of developing countries, because that's what's happening today. The developing countries who have the least balance sheet, the least stability, are having the greatest burdens to try and deal with global public goods. Thank you very much.
So Avinash, I will take the privilege of the moderator to ask you a follow-up before you have to run, which is, how do you see what you're proposing getting into financing for development at the midterm review of the SDGs?
Well, I think that, I think we need to do two things when we're looking at the development agenda. We need bold plans like GPI to be very clear where we are going and what our destination is. But we also need to look at where current doorways are opening. So, for example, the idea of getting concessional funding for a wider range of countries for climate adaptation, that door is beginning to open. The Sustainability and Resilience Trust by the IMF, it should be being done by the World Bank, but the World Bank is missing in action, and so the IMF has come up with a way of dealing with it. So we need to push that those things happen, that they're operationalized, and they're bigger. The multilateral development banks, I think you mentioned at the beginning, they could lend $1 trillion more. That should be our objective. Multilateral development banks lending $1 trillion more, and they can do it in three ways. It's not about undermining their credit rating. It's about they're not fully using their existing headroom. They can better utilize existing capital. They can have guarantees as capital, so not actual money, non-callable guarantees, not transfers, and they could be allowed to hold special drawing rights as capital. That will expand multilateral development bank lending by $1 trillion. And we can do that today. We can do that at the annual general meetings. So we need to be, there are a number of things that will make a difference that we need to be focused on, as well as the big picture and the changing architecture.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to come quickly back to Winnie and then go on to the rest of the panel. And to Winnie, I guess following up on Avinash, is there a role for African leadership in particular about creating more democratic ownership of these funds, a pandemic fund perhaps, or other funds moving forward?
Yes, Alicia, there is. First of all, I think the lessons from COVID were very, very painful for Africa. African people, we felt humiliated. Pulling our money together, our leaders came together. They came together, even though we saw the leaders of the big countries fleeing from a global crisis and hiding within their borders, as if they could find a solution there. But African leaders came together. They said, we've got to fight this together. Pulled their money together. But again, we saw the humiliation of being pushed back at the end of the queue, even with money, to buy PPEs to begin with, to buy the vaccine, told to stand at the back, and wait. Even when here in Europe and America there was hoarding of vaccines, they are getting wasted in stores as Africans waited without. This was a big lesson. But they came together. I felt proud then as an African to see our leaders come together, put even a strategy together for vaccine manufacturing, begin to do those things that should have happened before. So there is a role, and I think African leaders are stepping into the role. One of the roles is definitely to create the market that will allow for production on the continent, because we have to have continental manufacturing and production of health technologies. Every continent must have that capacity. But there's a need to build the capacity, and hubs have been built, and we are seeing south-south transfer of technology. I was recently in South Africa visiting AfriGem. This is the new plant that is not only producing for COVID, but setting up a platform for many health technologies of the to be produced in future, supported by WHO. But to do that, not only do we need to build the scientific community, but we must also build the market. And that's a hard one. But again, Africans have come together, built the Continental Free Trade Area. Now it is a question of harmonizing standards, removing trade barriers between the countries to get production for the region. It's not easy, but I'm seeing the leadership rising. Africa CDC, a new institution, it was just 4 years old, stood up and provided the leadership for Africa through COVID, and now is taking the struggle forward to building those platforms that we need for the technology to be produced in our own countries. Yes, African leadership needs to rise and come together, but also the global solidarity is key. We need to have global solidarity. I have to give credit to Johnson & Johnson, for example, as a company who set up a plant to produce COVID vaccines in Africa, but we failed them. We failed them because the market was not there, because international solidarity was not strong enough. But just to say that leadership from the corporate side, the government side is needed, partnerships are needed, and African leadership is rising to it. So the challenge.
And GPI can help create the state solidarity to shape those markets, in fact, incentivize them.
Absolutely. It is a framework that encourages regional production rather than maximizing of profits for just a few.
Naveed Hanif is Assistant Secretary of General for Economic Affairs and Development at the UNDESA, the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And I want to turn to you next. We've talked quite a bit about health. So I want to focus on progress generally, progress on the 2030 agenda, which has been radically reversed under COVID-19 and the climate emergency and inflationary pressures that the world is subject to now, and growing debt on sustainability. So in the short and medium term, how can sustainable financing stop this reversal and possibly get us back on track?
Thank you, Alicia, and thanks to the Ford Foundation and the organizers. We have no good news to give you. SDGs are really in reversal mode, and money is not coming forward. But I must commend GPI bringing two concepts together, public and investment. If you Google today SDG gap, you will find over 500 results. If you Google SDG investment, less than 10. That's the challenge we are confronted with. Before the pandemic, I can use the word gap, it was $2.4 trillion a year. Now it's above $4 trillion a year. UN has always advocated for public investment in the SDGs. You cannot privatize the SDGs. It will not happen. These will not be accomplished. No matter what the commitments private sector is making publicly, they just cannot invest in the SDGs the way public sector can and should invest. The first challenge, which is hitting hard everyone, is the debt burden. 60% of the low-income countries, 30% of the middle-income countries are in debt distress. You mentioned Pakistan. It's not only drowning in flood waters, it is drowning in debt. So if you want them to invest in the SDGs, first and foremost, they need fiscal space. It's missing. It's non-existent. 12% of the budget is left once they have met all their administrative and debt servicing expenditures. How will they invest in the SDGs? Be it education, health, social protection. So debt architecture has to be fixed, and we have to immediately request the G20 to resume Debt Servicing Suspension Initiative, DSSI, and expand it. We also have to find a solution by improving the common framework to create fiscal space for these countries by debt relief. This is immediately what we need to do. Then, before we create the GPI network effectively, it's launched today, we need to use the MDBs to accelerate and improve, enhance their lending. That's what we have right now, and we need to use it in terms of public money. The UN is proposing SDG stimulus, which is inspired by the COVID stimuli given by so many countries to the tune of over $10 trillion. Why can't we have SDG stimulus? What we are proposing is 2% of global GDP, which is around $2 trillion, to be given not as grants or charity, but made available to countries at concessional rates. 2% for 30 years. Why not? This is an investment in our future, in our common prosperity. And my last point is, financing can solve this problem if we are willing to make both architectural changes and immediate measures that are absolutely needed to avoid the social upheavals which will come our way. Today it's inequality, exclusion. Tomorrow it will be social upheaval. And I don't think many societies can afford it. Thank you, Alice.
So I don't want people to go away from this thinking that we are Pollyannish. So I want to come back to you, and you already gave a clue to sort of the uphill climb we have. But what are some glimmers of new thinking in development finance that could be leverage points to do some of the things you're talking about? How could GPI play a role in that?
For GPI, first and foremost is create space. Look, domestic action cannot be overemphasized. So GPI has to create space for domestic action. And I mentioned, I will not give the mantra of taxation. That's a totally different debate. But GPI should help in domestic space that countries need to create such investments that are needed. Development cooperation. I'm not saying quantity and quality both matter. ODAs may be insufficient to meet the demands. I won't say it's irrelevant. There are countries in this world who rely on ODA, and they badly need it. So please do not stop it. Countries need it, and they need more of it, and high quality. So for GPI, my request is quantity and quality both. So quantity is needed, scale it up. Quality. First and foremost, align with the national priorities, which should be embedded in the SDGs. Do not ignore a country's reality and its context. No imposition of external solutions. What the UN is doing, we're helping countries to develop, over 90 countries that we're helping now, integrated national financing frameworks. Needs assessment, financing strategy, monitoring and review in coordination. So once those are in place, GPI can help them to use the integrated financing frameworks to get the financing they need both from domestic and international level. Let me come to the international level. We all agree in this room, no country can achieve SDGs on the developing part of the world on their own. Even climate change requires global action. Consumption production patterns have to be changed globally. So international, we have three modalities which are repeatedly mentioned. Blended finance. Efficacy is questionable if it is not conceived properly, but it's an option available to leverage financing. Then innovative instruments we need to develop, and their private sector can play a significant role. Lending to countries who are at a disadvantage just because of the perception of risk, not the actual risk that you face in those countries. That has to be brought down by first loss guarantees. And those initiatives are available, can be conceived very precisely for sustainable development goals. Lastly, we need massive injection of flows on climate adaptation. Just look at Costa Rica yesterday. You were talking about Pakistan. Costa Rica has been the poster child of 1992 Rio Summit's outcome document, the way they have implemented. Poster child. Look at their sufferings. So unless we do something meaningful on adaptation, SDGs will become even more difficult to accomplish. Thank you.
Thank you. Daya, I want to turn to you now. Daya Saminarsi is the founder and CEO of the Center for Indonesia's Strategic Development Initiatives, CISD. And CISD has been working with GPI now for quite a while, and working in Indonesia, of course, is the head of the G20 this year, and you've been working on different aspects of GPI with us. CISD has really done a lot, not just sort of conceptually, but also helping to build the agenda of the Indonesian G20 and its co-leadership of the fifth civil society selection process. And I guess we'd all like to know, can you tell us what it is about GPI that has been so useful in these settings, and what it is that aligns so well with the perspectives of a middle-income country?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the organizers for having me. This is really an interesting time for a civil society person like myself and so many others, with the focus on, with GPI, focusing on our involvement, civil society involvement in ensuring funds are aligned with national priorities, that civil societies can help determine and identify those priorities that are happening on the ground. I think that is where the starting from, where my organization, CISD, is supporting GPI and thereby also supporting the government of Indonesia with this with its key role in the G20 presidency, but also in launching such an initiative where I think it's one of its kind. With the help of GPI, we have our share of experience of what didn't work during the Ebola crisis, where then right after similar funding to the fifth perhaps was initiated by the World Bank, but that didn't work. And based on that, we want to make sure that this time the efforts succeed, because during the pandemic, and it's still going on right now, civil society managed to work with minimum to depleting resources, and still support the government, still supporting the community, filling in the gaps where it existed because of lack of funding and resources available in the countries. And I think that's the positioning where the Indonesia presidency in G20 is key to ensure that we look forward in the pandemic preparedness mode, and civil society can play a key role there in ensuring that all of us are involved in the co-creation process, that we determine the outcome of what will happen with the funding, with the available funding, but also with creating together what is the priority for civil society and also for the communities. I think impacts and pandemic happens within the community, and it needs to be solved right there and then. And the ones who have eyes and ears and foot and our feet on the ground is civil society. And the expertise and experience of civil society, I think there has to be a shift of how we perceive civil society. We need to partner with civil society. We need to see civil society as thought leaders. Yes, of course, civil society must also present critiques where it helps to the betterment of the community. This is a very critical time where there is an opportunity presented by the GPI to co-create. And it is an opportunity that has to be seized by civil society. And we determine what, with our voice, what is important on the ground, what we think this funding should look like, how it should be implemented, how it should be dispersed. I think that's a key role and key opportunity right now.
So I want to just follow up on that by asking, you did work at the WHO, you're familiar with the Ebola response, so you have a very close knowledge of what went wrong in those other occasions. And what do you think the Pandemic Fund would need to do differently in terms of civil society's role?
I think...
And how could GPI principles be useful in that regard?
Ideally speaking, there should be an active communication between donors, countries, civil societies, and other key elements of development. I think what's missing is that we tend to wait for the other to take action. Right now, we need to take action together. And I think this is the moment where we can do that. And GPI has created the momentum and the platform and the space to do that, and not to wait for each other to take the action. I would like to point out that the inaction during the Ebola and of course during the pandemic has made lives lost, and right now it's our opportunity to rebuild, and that's why we need to take the actions now.
Thank you. And let's hope that with civil society pressure, there will be more democratic governance of the ultimate fifth with civil society voting seats. Solange, I'm going to turn to you at the end. ITPC really empowers communities to expand treatment access. And we've been talking a lot about the architecture of development finance, but you work with communities at the community level, and how can GPI actually make a difference to human beings' embodied realities?
Yeah, no pressure on that question. Yeah. So, look, yes, I come from the HIV world. I'm trying to mix my two hats now as a member of the expert working group and kind of thinking around the GPI principles and what it really means. You know, because I work in sort of the treatment space, I'm often in a space with a lot of clinical folks. and they love to do root cause analyses. And so we do a root cause analysis on X, and we realize that we're doing branch analyses because we're not getting to the root of the problem because they actually don't want to go that far. And I think I'm coming from a place of frustration, and GPI provides some hope, if I have to be brutally honest. Communities, civil society, just absolutely frustrated. The system does not work for us. The system is designed very well for those who have power to retain their power. So I'm not about fixing the system. I think we need to burn it all down and build something that works for communities. The thing that I've learned from HIV is certainly that the issue is not medical, it's not clinical. We don't necessarily have a problem of science or a problem of a new molecule. We've heard about all the new innovations, what's in the pipeline, there's a lots of excitement, but the issue is incentives. There are no incentives for those that have the power or have the money or whatever level you look at a national level, at a regional level, at the pharma, whatever, donor recipient level. There's no incentive for them to change and to relinquish the power so that there's more equality in a more open world. So I think GPI is exciting because it then allows civil society an opportunity to form part of the movement and help governments make that argument saying, this is what my people are saying. It is in my interest to actually listen to people. I think we have a problem when we assume that when governments speak, it's always what the people say. It's what, use the government as a proxy for the people. And oh my goodness, HIV has taught us, if nothing, that governments don't always speak on behalf of people. In fact, it's rare that they do, as we've heard on the panel today. So we really need to have civil society, communities, those affected, really to be able to speak up. And GPI is exciting for me for that reason. Thanks.
So we will now turn to the question and answer period. Perhaps if you have a question, could you just stand at the mic and say your name and to whom the question is directed? I think it's on.
It's on? It's on? Okay. It seems that I'm in a recording studio. It's kind of difficult to be the first one. So this is a very interesting forum, especially because everybody here that is attending knows the SDGs pretty well. And I guess that civil society is lacking knowledge on how to capitalize on the SDGs by bringing in the private sector. We cannot keep fighting with the private sector because, unfortunately, for us, they are the one with power and money. So I'm part of the civil society. I have been struggling for 8 years trying to figuring out how to engage the private sector. And my question to the panel is very simple. When we talk about the global public investment, we forget that there is a knowledge already created that is called the social return on investment. We have to really study arithmetic and economics as civil society in order to engage private sector more proactively with knowledge, not with a radical movement that push away people that needs to be at the table. So in this forum, we are falling short because civil society keep fighting with no knowledge about economics. When I hear Jeffrey Sachs 2 days ago at the Transforming Education Summit doing the arithmetic on how we can, close the gap, it's about doing the math, guys. So in order to be bold.
Excuse me, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question for the panel. I told you it is difficult to be the first, because you bring a lot of emotions in it, especially when you have a good friend that have been fighting for this thing for a long time. So my question to you is, we are talking about creating democratic ownership at a domestic level. How civil society, along with the private sector, can really work together in order to create a global public investment fund that doesn't take us apart. The private sector have a lot of knowledge, and I'm against the private sector, but they have knowledge that we don't have, and we need them at the table. So my question is how the global public funds can apply the social return on investment theory in order to work together with the private sector in a common, with a common approach. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Naveed, I think that's...
Thank you. First of all, I'm really very uncomfortable when we say it's an either-or choice. Nobody said private sector should not be part of the game. Please, every country, public, private, come together. That's when you progress. So let me be very clear. UN has never said it's an either-or choice. Bring them together and then advance. And let me give you personal, and credit goes to the Secretary General. In 2019, he launched Global Investors for Sustainable Development. 30 CEOs from all over the world, not just from the North, managing around $18 trillion. Look at their challenges. It took them 18 months to agree on a definition of sustainable finance. You talk about member states, look at their, and still they cannot implement in their own companies because the chief investment officers don't agree with it. Look at their challenges. Second, measurement and reporting. It's a minefield.
Yep.
But they're willing to work with us. And UN is working with them in developing credible measurement and reporting matrices. Then, once that is done, then what is the volume that will flow to those investments? They have come up with the idea they are creating $1 billion fund for infrastructure investment. They said neither the World Bank nor the UN. They have an independent asset manager, which was selected through merit-based process, who will manage to provide funding. It's minuscule, but to concept that you don't have to go project by project. An instrument is available, any company can invest in a piece of that instrument while investing in developing countries in sustainable infrastructure. And there are a number of such initiatives going around. So my request to you is, private sector is not the enemy. They are partners, but bring them around the table with clarity that this is the UN's objective or your objectives.
Yeah.
Do not undermine them when you're pursuing them. If they continue to invest in fossil fuels and they're investing in sustainable investment, $1 billion, 10 billion fossil fuels, then the commitment is questionable. So we have to strike that balance also. Thank you, Alicia.
Are there other questions from the floor? Please just go to the mic and...
Thank you, everyone, for a really excellent discussion. I'm Kate Donald from the Centre for Economic and Social Rights. Earlier in the panel, something was referred to, which I really agree with, about the need. We need to be taking immediate action, but we also need to kind of undertake systemic reform of the global financial architecture. But I wanted to kind of raise the conflict and a bit of an elephant in the room, which is that in some cases, the latter is a massive obstacle to the former. So, if, for example, we haven't had much reference to the IMF, but if you're thinking about fiscal space constraints in the global south and the kind of investment gap in the SDGs, the fact that the IMF is going around telling countries to cut their social spending is a huge issue. So I wanted to ask the panelists where they see the role of institutions like the IMF in this. And one more very, very short thing is, we talked about the global balance sheet, and how about the idea of debt cancellation, not just suspension, but debt cancellation as a kind of start-up investment in the global balance sheet. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to answer that? Naveed again, or I can start. My preliminary answer, and then I'll turn it over to the panelists, is that we know that GPI alone is not enough. The rigged rules of the game need to change. If the IMF decided that it wanted to sign up to the GPI network right away, that would be the kiss of death, right? So we also, this is an iterative process that we are building in conjunction with a lot of other social movements and social action. We absolutely know that debt needs to be tackled, tax justice needs to be tackled, intellectual property regimes need to be tackled. Going a little bit to the former question of how much public investment went into the development of the vaccines and how the profits were then privatized scandalously. So we know that this is not the answer, it's not a magic bullet. And we also are very aware that there's a kind of Lorenz effect where you have to, a butterfly effect, where you have to trigger changes in the short term that lead to much bigger changes without reproducing the same kind of colonialist logics.
Alicia, first of all, UN has maintained for the last 30 years sovereign debt architecture needs major overhaul. And I must give credit to IMF also. They have also acknowledged 2 years ago that given the current debt landscape, which has evolved significantly, we need to revisit sovereign debt architecture. So there is emerging global consensus. We may disagree on solutions, but we all agree sovereign debt architecture is out of date. Now, I agree with Alicia. Do not ignore the patient while you're fixing the hospital. Immediate measures are needed and should be undertaken with great speed. 6 months ago, we still say systematically significant countries are not in debt distress, you can ignore them. No, it is now heading towards a systemic crisis because systematically significant countries are also in distress. Let's not ignore it. UN's immediate proposals, credit rating agencies' role should be revisited. Debt sustainability assessment by the IMF should have SDGs as one of the considerations. If you are investing in sustainable development, which has long-term returns, usually DSA is 2 to 3 years. The time horizon should be changed, at least 5 years, and scenarios should be developed. So a country that is borrowing to invest in the SDGs should have better sustainability assessment. So we have proposed these things, and let's give them credit. They're open. IMF is open at this juncture because they realize it's an unmanageable debt burden. They have to find a solution. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. I am Alfredo Espinosa from Vital Strategies, a global public health nonprofit organization. And this is my question. I find the concept that all countries contribute, all benefit, and all get to decide incredibly attractive in the abstract. But could you please elaborate a little bit on the hows? How will the fair share basis be defined? What does a meaningful say in the governance actually mean? And how will the shared definition of need be defined? Thank you.
Right, so again, I can start. I also, at this point, it might be good to call upon my colleagues in the expert working group who are in the room. Christophe Ben, who's here in the first row, Jonathan Glennie, Simon Reed-Henry is also in the room, as well as Solange. Anton Ophel-Kerr is also somewhere in the room. So some of that is yet to be worked out, right? There is no formula that is dictated. We do believe that it requires actual voting seats and governance, not just for low and middle income countries on these funds, but also for civil society. But what the actual technical contributions, how much, the percentages, that will be worked out in different cases. And maybe, Ibudayo, you would like to speak to that in Indonesia and the work that you're doing. Because GPI will be piloted. There will be projects. There will be experiments. And we will learn from those experiments. And we hope that by the financing for the post-2030 agenda, it will be deeply rooted in the financing for that agenda. But it will certainly be piloted in different ways in different places, regionally and for different subjects.
Perhaps I can add about the civil society element that we are doing. We have undertaken 2 consultations in 2 different time zones for Asia, Africa, and then for the Europe and America, where we invite, I think, close to 100 at the highest consultation. The attendance was about 140 civil society organizations, and we discuss and consult about what do we have to do if the opportunity comes to access the funding. How should the governance mechanism be? What do we think civil society, how we should involve civil society in it? I think, again, that's an experiment, but we are very happy with what we received from those consultations, that now we have 2 interim CSO representatives in the governing board of the FIF, where it was selected by the interim consortium, and I think it's going to get even stronger as things progress and as more experiments are being done.
Yes, sir. You've been waiting a long time.
My name's Chris Collins. I'm with Friends of the Global Fight in the U.S. Thank you for this great session. I guess my question is, what do you think of this idea? First of all, I do think there's a moment of hope here that we should observe. The FIF for pandemic preparedness had 0 civil society on it at the beginning. That turned around pretty much on a dime when civil society screamed and yelled. It changed in a couple months. There's a way in which people are beginning to realize that kind of thing, not including civil society, is just unacceptable. It's not how we do business anymore. So I think we have seen in the near term how the understanding of what we want to do together can be changed, even at the World Bank, which is a hard institution to change. So looking forward on GPI, one is, I'd also love to hear, as part of the discussion about what can be accomplished concretely with GPI investment. How many lives are going to be saved? What will the investments be? What will the progress be on climate? That's one of the things that can be a motivator for people. Certainly in HIV, in Global Fund replenishment, it's all about what we're going to accomplish together. And that's one thing to think about in terms of GPI, particularly since so many of the things that GPI wants to address are synergistic. Environment, global health, these are interconnected. We know this. So I think we can start talking about the possible results of this investment, not just that the system is broken, but what we can deliver if we actually can get this to scale. Another one is, it seems like another next step is, this could get more real if we could point to the money on the table to be spent more wisely and more democratically. I heard from the gentleman who was speaking first about the money in multilateral development banks. Does GPI want to also be part of an Unlock the Money campaign? Let's make money in multilateral development banks work for moving forward for society, for global equity. Let's have an Unlock the Money campaign to really raise awareness about that money not being used. Another is financial transaction tax, which was an idea that was gaining steam and is still a great idea. And I think GPI might consider taking not ownership, but really embracing those ideas as a way of saying, we're not just talking about how the system needs to change, we're talking about what results we're going to achieve, and we're talking about how we get that money.
I think those are great points, and I think we're now at a stage where we're moving into that phase of not just talking about why we need this now, but what it's going to do for us. Thanks, Chris.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Alois Urasa. I'm from Tanzania. I'm truly inspired as a young advocate being in this house with great minds and leaders, especially inspired with my inspiration, Mama Winnie. I'm really happy. Yeah, so I have, the first is a question that has been really troubling me, and I feel that this is a very safe space to ask this question. And I'll start with, in Tanzania, for instance, the price of Coca-Cola, the soda that we take, is 600 wherever you go. If you're in town, you'll buy it for 600 Tanzanian shillings. If you go to the village, you'll buy it at the same price. But I also deal with a startup on medical equipment, so I always search for prices for health commodities. For instance, delivery kit would cost between $5 to $20, depending on where you are. If you're in town, you'll get it for $5 or less. But if you go to a village, it's 20 or more. Now, how can this all big discussions on global public investment help to solve this problem, bring a solution similar to that of Coca-Cola, of harmonizing the cost of product and ensuring that it's accessible everywhere in the community. Wherever you go, you'll find a Coca-Cola. If you want a drink in a local village, you'll find it. But searching for a searcher kit or like a switcher training kit somewhere in a village, you'll suffer to get it. And another question goes to, not a question actually, it's like ask to the GPI. May the GPI plan be truly intentional to touch the very last person in the community. There are so many discussions that I've attended about health financing, investment, but still the problems remain the same to the very last people in the community. May this plan become truly intentional to solve the problems of the people at a very low level in the community. It is not a solution if it's not going to touch these people. And the last is a request that may also GPI think of an intergenerational solidarity as we create these solutions to make them more sustainable. Create a chain of experts for the global public investments by 2030, by 2063, by engaging young people into developing these solutions so that in future we have great and long-learned experts in the global public investments and international collaborations for health financing and investment for global public goods. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, on that last part, I'll say we welcome youth leadership into the GPI network, and we are looking to youth leadership. And I'll turn to Winnie to answer briefly. I think we have to be briefer in our questions and answers.
Yeah, it's thank you for your kind compliment. The question you raise about consumable products like Coca-Cola going cheap and the same price everywhere, and health technologies costing more, different prices in different places. I think you are touching on how health technologies are produced and sold. That's the key question. That's what we've been fighting on. Having equitable access to health technologies. The fact that they are produced by private entrepreneurs, which is fine, but that they set their price with no transparency about the cost they have put in, the cost that comes from research and development, fundamental research and development that's usually public, the fact that then they set their profits and you cannot know whether this is a super profit, a reasonable profit, or even a product that they are giving at no profit. They often say it's no profit when it actually is also for profit. These are the questions we want addressed. We don't think that a health technology should be sold using the same principles as you sell a Gucci handbag. One is life-saving, the other is a luxury good. They cannot be treated the same. So you're touching on that question of access to medicines, intellectual property rules that were created only a few years ago. I mean, they didn't always exist. There was a time when governments regulated how health technologies are produced, invested in them, invited the private sector to invest, but controlled the price so that profits are not excessive and so that everyone gets treated if they need the treatment. So we need to go back to thinking, how do we incentivize production of health technologies? What is the right reward? What is the role of government and the role of the private sector? These things can't be left in the hands of profit seekers. Our lives cannot be in the hands of profit sector. They can't be the ones to decide who lives and who dies when governments are sitting there, elected by us. So you're touching on a real issue of health rights and passing the right to health to profit seekers. It's wrong. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Alex Scott from E3G. And this may have been a question to Avinash, who left us with that idea that we need both leaders pushing for the final outcome as well as using where there are cracks in the door, where the doors are open at the moment. But Solange, I'm particularly interested in your take on this because you said, not interested in fixing the system we have, I want that ultimate outcome. Of those examples, and Chris gave us some of them, of where there is a bit of political energy, there is some movement in the global finance system for some reforms, of those ideas that are out there at the moment, what do you feel might start kind of snowballing some of the political will towards the big shift that you guys are recommending here?
Thanks for your question. I think it actually goes back to the first question. Yes. I think civil society needs to know what's happening. I think there is a bit of a gap in terms of understanding the communication, the narrative, the entry points, because we often have a conversation here at a very macro level, so multilateral donors, countries, regions, blocks, but what does it mean for at the subnational and at the local level? And I think that is part of the answer to the question. So being able to get civil society and communities that are affected by climate change, by inequity in health, to actually be able to know what they need to advocate for and where the entry points are actually coming up within the horizon that we can change things. I think the other thing to think about is that we actually have a very important role in stopping bad things. So it's this, I love the patient, deal with the patient, but also build the hospital. I love that, but also don't do harm to the patient while you're trying to do everything else. So I think the fifth is a great example of saying, okay, this is still bad, but let's see if we can try to get something in there that wasn't there before, and that was sort of a success, but it's not what we want. So we know we want to get to the hospital, but we're still trying to do no harm. So stopping bad things has been like kind of holding the line has been something that people who work in human rights have always tried to do. Like, look, we've succeeded because worse things didn't happen. That sometimes is the metric for success. So I think we need to kind of think of what that means from a civil society perspective when we think about GPI. Thanks.
Khalil?
Hello, I'm Khalil Ovardigi. I'm with Equal. It seems that to a large extent, GPI is about replacing the donor-recipient paradigm with one where all countries are at the same time recipients and donors. So my question for the panel is, what would it change for this to happen, for example, for the fifth, for the SDG negotiations, and for funding the global AIDS response? What would it change if, for those three fights, if we moved from donor-recipient dichotomy to everyone is a donor, everyone is a recipient at the same time, at a different mix based on income level?
Certainly for HIV, a world of difference. What we would have is that the best of science, at the moment that it is found and hits the market, goes to those who need it the most first. And we would be sure that never again would you have a vaccine and people dying without getting it in their arms. It would never happen again. Why? Because all countries would be putting in money. Already governments put in money to make these health technologies. But in terms of producing and getting them to people, you don't need to be rich to come from a rich country to be the first to get a vaccine if you are the one most in need. It would equalize. Definitely global public investment would save us from pandemics. We would have outbreaks, but they would never lead to pandemics because health technologies would be moved swiftly to where the source is, where the weakest link is. And that's how you stop a pandemic. That's my answer. That certainly this is a model that would take us out of the world of continuous pandemics, let's be honest. This is not the last one. The next one is waiting to come and hit us, and we'll be where we were with COVID. Nothing has changed. The system is the same.
I think if I can add to that, to Winnie's perspective, for civil society, especially civil society organizations in the Global South, I think the GPI opens up a whole new perspective of being able to channel expertise and knowledge from the ground, from communities and subnational government to global level, and to create scale and impact. And I think also realization that there is a way for us to know, to receive information, to share and exchange information on health equity, on the pandemic itself, on what we think will be best for the future of the countries in which we work in. And it can be shared at national level, but also it can be shared at regional level, and of course breaking into the global level and push for health equity further. Thank you.
Navid, I think you had a few comments here.
Just a brief comment, and I'm sure you and Jonathan Glennie must be thinking about it. Just want to leave this thought with you. I'm not advocating. When you mention the SDGs or climate change, you are likely to get responses about common but differentiated responsibilities. You are likely to get questions about how can you assure the governance will be on equal footing. So I'm just flagging these things for you because you will come across the street to the UN at some stage. So these are very germane thoughts in that debate, and Jonathan must be thinking about it. So please be ready with the answers. Thank you.
I think for HIV, if we had GPI, we would arrive at a cure very soon. We would have a cure, even maybe a vaccine. The way we saw money brought and put behind COVID, if we had that same concentration of resources in this pandemic that is hitting mostly Southern people, I think we would be sooner out of the crisis of HIV.
Thank you. I think this may be the last question before we move into a networking session and continue the discussion offline.
That's a hard spot to be in. Frédéric Röder, I'm from Global Citizen, and thanks so much for this discussion today. I basically want to join the call to be as propositional as possible and move into this next phase. So, for instance, calling to unlock the SDRs, more financing from the multilateral development banks. The financial transaction tax was mentioned, and just to say that we also stand ready to work with you on this. I think, first of all, there is, or I want to believe that there is a window of opportunity actually to push for measures like this that actually would present a major shift in financing development and climate change. I also believe that this is important to actually avoid what is potentially a risk, is actually that certain countries, especially the wealthy donor countries, are using this concept to actually find an excuse not to continue financing ODA. I'm hearing that we're moving into a world, obviously, where we would not need this any longer, but the reality is at this stage, especially the poorest countries, obviously still need official development assistance. We have the global fund replenishment in 2 days. We know that we won't hit the 18 billion without increases in ODA contributions. So this is incredibly important, and at the same time we know that there is already a real risk, or is actually already happening in a lot of countries, that ODA is under threat. So I think just wanted to throw this out, maybe also want to discuss the networking reception, but how we avoid this risk and rather make sure that we get the ODA increases now that we need, while also pushing those systemic changes that we've been discussing. Thank you.
Right. So I will reiterate that this is not meant to just replace ODA. We know we need a lot more money, but we also know that we need it to be better money, and we need it to incentivize private investments in a specific way. But GPI is not meant to replace ODA anytime soon. It's going to bring in additional money for common needs and public goods. So I think we have hit the time for what? Oh, okay. Winnie needs to leave, so we will thank her very much.
Mine can be really brief. I'm Asia Russell from Health Gap, and it's just a joy to see GPI come from the hunger to the vision and the execution. And I think that's the observation. It'll also just go into the networking zone, which is we face a critical point where duty bearers are starting to use these words, but they mean them in different ways. And so how we fill this final credibility gap, where the FIF is now not only talking about co-financing countries and putting some seats around the table, but at the same time, they're prepared on September 30th, when the first substantial meeting happens, not to fund what the most at-risk communities need, but instead to fund business as usual when it comes to pandemic preparedness, prevention, and response. So unwilling to take that final step, which requires more than brilliant ideas. It requires accountability and agitation, because this is truly, I mean, not just an ambitious, but ultimately almost a revolutionary vision about moving away from what's most wrong about the current model to something that everyone can see in this room, but now we must make those who are much more powerful across the street rise to the occasion. So looking forward to making it happen with everyone in this room.
So I will just wrap up before we go to the networking session next door. And following on what Asia was saying, I mean, for transformative change, you need some kind of programmatic vision that is not utopian, but also not trivial. And we believe that GPI sits at that sweet spot. What it becomes, and to make sure that it doesn't co-opted, requires a movement. It requires a civil society movement, and we invite all of the civil society and academic thinkers here to join the GPI network. We invite all of the government delegates to continue to work on this in terms of all of the different opportunities that Solange mentioned at the beginning. We hope to see you at the networking session. We're delighted that so many of you came. This has been a long process to get to this point, and we have a much further way to go. Thank you for your interest and excitement.